There was major news from the FDA earlier this week with the announcement of emergency use authorization of convalescent plasma for treatment of COVID-19. Many public health and infectious disease experts, even those who acknowledge that convalescent plasma could benefit patients, have questioned the data that the EUA was based on and the way that the FDA presented the data to the public. So, Mike, my question for you is, does this decision by the FDA raise concerns for you about how the agency will handle review and approval of a vaccine?
The FDA's modern regulatory functions really begin with the passage of the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act, a law that was a quarter century in the making that basically prohibited interstate commerce in adulterated and misbranded food and drugs. And it has been a critical part of assuring that consumers are receiving safe food and drugs for the past 114 years. I can't emphasize enough how those of us in public health have counted on the FDA's regulatory science work, meaning that there is a science to this in terms of how do you measure how effective a drug is or how safe a drug is or what the implications might be for side effects. And so this has been a very, very important part of our public health system and our medical care system in this country. And they have done it with very little controversy. There are times that some of us have challenges about one aspect of regulatory science or enforcement, but basically we've counted on them to be the umpire, to call balls and strikes as fairly as they possibly can, so that we as the public knows what drugs are safe, what drugs are effective, what vaccines are safe and effective. And so this is not a small issue because it covers so much of our everyday lives. When COVID-19 first arrived on the scene, the FDA was immediately brought into the activity in terms of helping to understand what kind of tests we need to have and how to approve them so that we could effectively inform people were they infected or not and they were available. We understood the need for drugs, safe drugs, effective drugs. We also understood the real weapon we were going to have in this pandemic eventually would be a vaccine, and that we needed to understand how these vaccines would protect. Do they protect? How safe are they? And who are they safe for? Everyone or just some? And so the challenge with the FDA began virtually immediately with the pandemic emergence around the issue of testing. People who have listened to this podcast know that I was very critical early on to the FDA for basically creating an environment equivalent to the Wild Wild West, where because there had been such a shortage of testing, they started to approve almost anything that was considered a possible test. And we saw junk literally on the market being marketed as an FDA approved test in the sense that it was signed off by the FDA, not having been evaluated by them. And that's improved. We still have challenges with testing. But then there was a whole issue of how do we speed along drug and vaccine development that we needed critically. We needed to be done as quickly as possible, but we needed to be thorough. We can't cut corners because in a sense, if we put something out that's not safe, first of all, you injure the patient who receives that drug or that vaccine, and at the same time, you never really do find out what works because you're not testing all the different products. So there was a lot of concern about would the FDA be under some kind of political pressure to move things along, and we saw that with hydroxychloroquine and the fact that the White House basically pushed this drug. Now, on this podcast, I have been absolutely nonpartisan agnostic. I've served roles in the last 5 presidential administrations. I served 2 Democratic governors, 2 Republican governors, 1 independent governor, a state epidemiologist. I just had a role in this administration for a year, serving as a citizen science envoy for the State Department. And I've just tried to call balls and strikes too. That's it. Not partisan. So please take my comments today as someone who is just merely talking about the critical nature of our safety system for drugs and vaccines. So I was concerned, like many, that the interference, in a sense, of what was seen as a political decision was overriding the science decisions. You saw the challenges of that. You saw the challenges with testing. We continue to have challenges with what was an approval for the hydroxychloroquine to come on the market as an emergency authorized product. That subsequently was revoked, but it was a real challenge in terms of, wow, could the FDA be influenced in a way that we'd never seen before? Well, then there has been this rush to bring products forward. And, you've seen all the rhetoric. I'm not going to go into it about what this means. But let me just share with you a piece that was missing this past week that didn't get discussed. This is regarding one of the drugs that initially was hailed as a major breakthrough. And the rhetoric placed with it accordingly by, again, largely political leaders from our country. And this was remdesivir. Remdesivir is a drug that had been evaluated in the early studies, case control, randomized placebo-controlled trials. And this was a drug that received the emergency authorization designation. And here's the conclusion of the final paper that got published this week. And let me just read it for you. It says, among patients with moderate COVID-19, those randomized to a 10-day course of remdesivir did not have a statistically significant difference in clinical status compared with standard care at 11 days after initiation of treatment. Patients randomized to a 5-day course of remdesivir had a statistically significant difference in clinical status compared with standard care, but the difference was of uncertain clinical importance. Is that a breakthrough drug? Is that one that you could hang your hat on that was going to make great clinical difference, and yet it was hailed as such, and it was pushed? Well, now along comes the issue with the plasma therapy. And, we're looking for whatever we can bring, even if it's a layered effect of a number of different drugs that may help. But you have seen the rhetoric in the last 2 weeks. The FDA initially said there was not sufficient data out of the more than 70,000 people who received this drug. There was never a randomized placebo-controlled trial, meaning that ability to assess those who got the drug, those who got a placebo or an inert product, and no one knew who got what in terms of the clinicians, but only the study directors did, and they could break that code and find out, did it really work or not? Well, as you know, when you don't have a randomized controlled trial, then you might have some other endpoints you can use. But what happened was a week ago, the FDA, with some NIH input, said we don't have sufficient information here to approve emergency use authorization. Then suddenly, after some very public statements by leaders in the administration, that tune changed. And on the night before the political convention, the drug is announced to have an emergency use authorization. At that point, there were many people who were very challenged by what that meant, and meaning that if once you did that, you'd never really be able to study this again because of the fact that who's going to take a potential placebo if they know that they can get the drug on emergency use authorization as opposed to enrolling in such a study. And then on top of it, the FDA Commissioner, Stephen Hahn, actually misspoke and basically acknowledged later that when he said there was a claim of a 35% reduction in mortality, it was not 35% overall, it was 35% of those who have died might not have died, not all people. It was a very different statement. It was a relative, not an absolute risk and reduction. And we've had members of the senior leadership of the administration make misstatements out there about how effective this was already. And, when we hear statements constantly being made about this is going to be done on Trump time, not regular regulatory time, that becomes a real concern. Again, not a partisan statement. I'd be saying this with regard to whoever was in leadership positions in the FDA. Now, we're concerned that this past week was released a statement that, in fact, it's possible that a vaccine will be released before the election. This has been deemed by some as the October surprise. This was discussed by the administration with leadership on the Hill. And I can tell you it has sent up 1,000 red flags among my colleagues and me, because we have to make sure that these vaccines are safe and effective. We know time is of the essence, but at the same time, you can't cut corners on that. The public deserves that. And what was challenging about this is the fact that if this were to occur, based on the precedents we've seen between lab testing, hydroxychloroquine, remdesivir, the whole issue with plasma therapy, there's a pattern here that's developing that is very concerning. Would, in fact, there be a surprise vaccine released? And this one we can give you a pretty good hint on, is that, in fact, there won't be a vaccine ready to go by October. It's like the Iowa farmer who decides that he wants to take the second half of the summer off, so he plants twice as many acres in April so he can harvest in July, so he doesn't have to wait until September. Well, that doesn't work that way. We know how many people have been enrolled in these studies. We know where these studies are at in terms of what it's going to take to fulfill the kind of testing program that will be necessary to see how effective these vaccines are and how safe they are. And, I am just one of many who are looking carefully at this. And I sit in on a weekly conference call each week with the Operation Warp Speed people, listening to what's going on, understanding what plans are being developed. And there's just no way that this vaccine will be ready. My worst nightmare with this, one day there'll be a vaccine put forward as a authorized vaccine under emergency use authorization. Two things will happen. One is many of us will have to stand up and say no, which will then only fulfill this sense that somehow public health is trying to block some other outcome, when it's all we're trying to do is protect the public. And then we'll cause all kinds of credibility issues with vaccines in general. If we're saying, no, this vaccine isn't adequately tested, we don't know. I mean, I can't imagine the public's viewpoint of all this. They're going to be swaying in this hurricane wind of what's going on. That's number one. Number two is that once you have an emergency use authorization vaccine approved, it's going to pretty much shut down the programs for all the rest of the vaccines in terms of understanding how well they work. Because if I'm there and I got a vaccine that's approved, why am I going to take a potential experimental vaccine or the placebo that goes with it? Why would I do that? That'll shut those programs down. So, ladies and gentlemen, I just can't tell you enough how, man, I lose sleep over this. This is really concerning. And we must demand an apolitical, scientific, rigorous evaluation of any of these products done with Godspeed. No room for, weekends off. This is a 24/7, 365-day operation. But we've got to do it right. And if we don't, we will, I believe, lose so much credibility, if we've not already lost it, among the public in terms of what we can do and can't do from a public health standpoint and the safety and the effectiveness of vaccines and these drugs. So I know this was a long, drawn-out explanation, but this is I can't tell you how important this is. This is really important. I count on the integrity of the FDA, both as individuals who work there, but also as an agency for my kids and my grandkids. That's what I count on. I want to make sure that the vaccines that my kids and grandkids are getting are safe. I got to count on it. I can't count on a political decision. I need a scientific decision. So I just, if it sounds like I'm into this, I am, because I just have never imagined anything that could be like this. I had the good fortune to spend time years before he died with Tom Clancy, the famous author. Never forget one night he looked at me and said, Mike, the only difference between reality and fiction is that fiction has to make sense. And I'm challenged right now. So be it. This is where I'm at. This is not a partisan statement. I would love nothing more than to see all these drugs and vaccines come on the market as soon as possible, right now, if they could. But they've got to stand up to the test of time and the test of regulatory science.